How do humans perceive risk? When we evaluate risky situations, are we aware that we're being influenced by others? In this episode, decision scientist Professor Wolfgang Gaissmaier gives us insight into risk perception and communication within the human collective. Hello, and a very warm welcome from us all here in sunny Konstanz. Today I'm very excited to have an esteemed guest here to lead us a bit away from our flocks of animals and back into the world of the human minds. Very, very happy to have you here. Thank you so much for giving us your time. It's Professor Wolfgang Gaissmaier.
Hello, a very good afternoon to all of you.
Do you want to maybe talk a bit about your involvement in the collective behavior cluster overall?
Yeah, so how did I get into collective behavior? I was already at Konstanz for a couple of years. And then I received this email by Carla Avolio inviting us to a meeting, basically harvesting ideas about do we have anything to say about collective behavior from psychology, which is actually a science of how individuals make decisions and feel and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's very strange to be two psychologists in this room because we've been doing collective behavior.
I would rather say the opposite. So we think we are so individualistic. These were our own ideas, how to dress, what music to like and what not. Free will. But in the end, actually, we just imitate others to a very strong degree.
Okay, before we go on a tangent any further, why decision-making? Like, why did you get in here in the first place as a researcher?
I was always interested in psychology, actually, already when I was in high school. And I got in touch with research relatively early on by meeting some researchers from the local Max Planck Institute. There, she was a developmental psychologist, actually. And I started a job as a student assistant in her group, did some study like diary studies on goal setting and goal following, like in the developmental sense. And that was interesting. So I got in touch with that. I also got in touch with some neuropsychology or like neuropsychological methods, did my diploma thesis, which is equivalent to a master's thesis on EEG recording of actually sequence learning and stuff like that. So very basic. So I explored in different directions. And then when I was completely free of all the written exams and everything, not the oral final ones, but all the written ones, I was having a seminar by Gerd Gigerenzer, who was the Max Planck director in the Center for Adaptive Behavior and Cognition at the Berlin Max Planck Institute for Human Development. And so I didn't need course credit or anything in this seminar. It was about decision making. It was about risk and all of that. And it was probably the first seminar where I've read all the texts every week, which I didn't always do before that. And it was a 10 a.m. Monday morning seminar, which was also a time when I typically wouldn't be around at the university. But it was so exciting that I really wanted to be there. And Gerd was so enthusiastic about the decision sciences, about risk communication, about the stuff that he was doing, about the research that he was doing, that I thought, well, if this guy is so enthusiastic about what he is doing, then it might be just good. And I loved his enthusiasm. He was really an inspiration for me. And then I thought, I want to do my PhD with this guy. Right. So I fought my way into his group because he didn't have a position anymore. But he kind of helped me with a student assistant contract in his group so that I had some time to get a stipend externally. And then I got a position a year later on. And in between, I could finance myself with a stipend. So I actually had 4 years time for doing my PhD, which was fairly relaxed. And yeah, I just loved this research so much and loved this research group so much that I simply didn't want to leave. And I actually didn't leave in total for, I think, 11 and a half years. And then a now billionaire came along, David Harding, who gave us some money to study risk communication, particularly in medicine and education. These were the topics that were interesting to him, not personally or professionally. I think he just thought it's cool to spend some money on good science, and he had plenty of that money.
Let's talk about risk. Why risk perception? Let's maybe start with that. What is it and why do we study it?
I think risk is actually a fascinating concept in the first place. Also the underlying concept of probability. And of course, then risk is a function of both probability and severity or harm, magnitude, or whatever. And I think it's so fascinating because it is all around us, and it is something that is extremely important for human decision making. And it is something where things can go terribly awry, which is also why I find it fascinating. So human animals are often afraid of the wrong things. Yeah? And that is something I do find fascinating. Why is that so? So, for example, people are more afraid of flying rather than driving, although driving is, of course, much more dangerous. You only need to drive about 20 kilometers and you already have the same risk of dying compared to an overseas flight. People are also much more afraid of genetically modified food and are not afraid of sitting all day long, which most of us do, which is probably way more dangerous actually than genetically modified foods. And I do find this interesting, especially because it's so basic for our decision making. How come that in some specific areas actually our perception is such a strong misperception? And why is our perception so accurate in other parts? Yeah? So also that comparison. So it's not to say that humans are all irrational and they get everything wrong. It's not the case, actually. They get most things right, but then they get some predictable things wrong. And it's of course, interesting to also study those and see what we can do about it, how we can help people make better decisions under risk.
Okay, so what are these things that we're getting so wrong all the time? And do we have like the first answers as to why? Like, is it weighing that we receive certain information that has some sort of affect tied to it, and then therefore, it hits us more, so to speak?
Yeah, affect surely plays a role, but I think there are some more basic issues that are at play here. So when humans evolved, there were no statistics available, right? There was no summary statistic about something. You just had, basically you had individual observations of trying something out and seeing how often you were failing or how often your stomach turned bad after eating something or so. And you had the observation of others around you and what they were doing. So this was basically all experience-based, all our assessment of risk. And an experience-based assessment of risk is, also not perfectly accurate, but tends to be relatively accurate. We are very good at assessing proportionality in some sense. So that works fairly well. But now we live in a time where actually summary statistics are available and we have much more condensed information about many, many, many issues in a very different format than we are used to. And that, I think, creates many problems that we very often don't understand statistics very well. We can be easily misled by statistics. We have even done studies with experts such as physicians, and we can mislead them completely by presenting the same underlying clinical data from clinical trials in different ways. And they can be made to believe that some medical procedure is either great or devastating. And we have done this within subjects, actually. Okay. And you can flip the physician's mind.
Really, we're just framing.
Really, but by presenting true information in a statistical way about the clinical data. Yeah. Okay. But depending on how you present it, you can just flip them.
So Wolfgang just mentioned that framing plays a huge role in the way we interpret information. So let's say, for example, that 10% of women who tested positive during screening for breast cancer actually have breast cancer. Now, this is the conclusion that you have to reach, but there are two ways that we can deliver you information, either by natural frequencies or by conditional probabilities. Alex, how would this sound like when we are using natural frequencies?
Yeah, so basically when using natural frequencies framing, you use actual numbers to kind of showcase this information. So in this case, let's say there are 1,000 women who got screened for breast cancer. And out of those 1,000 women, 10 of them actually has breast cancer. And out of those 10 breast cancer patients, 9 of them test positive and 1 of them tested negative. And for the other 919 non-breast cancer women, 89 of them tested positive incorrectly, and the others 901 tested negative correctly. So to get to the final answer, one would basically divide the number of women who actually got breast cancer over the total number of women who tested positive. Yeah, so that would be 9 over 9 plus 89, which is 9 over 98, and that's around 10%.
Okay, yeah, well, that sounds feasible. And how would the information be presented if we will be using conditional probabilities?
Yeah, so using conditional probability framing, basically, instead of numbers, you use actual probability and percentages. So to frame that using conditional probability, I would really basically say for any given woman, there's 1% chance they get breast cancer and 99% chance they don't. And for the 1% chance that they have breast cancer, there's a 90% chance that they test positive and 10% that they don't. And for the 99% where they do not have breast cancer, there's actually a 9% chance they test positive and 91% where they don't. So to calculate the final answer, one needs to multiply 0.01 times 0.9 over 0.01 times 0.9 plus 0.99 times 0.09.
Wow, I think you kind of lost me, but is this still equal to around 10%?
Yes, so basically, if you do the actual calculations, it's also got to the same answer of 10%.
Okay, and in this study, were there some differences in the results, depending on whether the participants were presented with natural frequencies or with conditional probabilities?
Yeah, so in the study, basically, the participants were given 4 choices, and for the conditional probability framing, only 21% of them got it right, which is more or less like random choice. While for the natural frequency framing, up to 87% got it right.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So let's go back to Wolfgang and Nak to find out more also on risk perception in general.
This was what I started studying when I studied risk, how we can represent the information so that it becomes transparent actually and understandable. And we can now, we have developed methods how we can do this pretty well, how we can make people understand statistics.
Okay.
So that part I think we are relatively good at by now. The frustrating part was when I realized that it was really frustrating. That doesn't really change decision making. So we can get people to understand these statistics, and it helps to some degree, and I still find it extremely important. I do believe in enlightenment, but seeing that it doesn't really change people's minds, that was quite shocking for me.
So maybe perhaps we need to start younger.
Yeah, I think starting younger would definitely help, and I'm also still surprised how much of the mathematics education is about really unimportant stuff, except for basic algebra.
Yes.
And like the important dirty mathematics, statistics, they are often not taught, also because typically the assumptions do not hold, right? Okay, we can play dice and cards, and there the assumptions hold perfectly for probability theory. It's nice, but these are boring problems. But as soon as we start going out into the real world, into the wild, then the assumptions don't really hold anymore. We just can get estimates of things. It's not precise anymore. And mathematicians don't like that very much. But I think it's actually really, really an important skill to know how to assess data, to know what kind of conclusions you can draw from data. So I think it goes deeper than, and this is the lesson I learned. It goes deeper than just understanding the numbers. So this, I think, would also be important to discuss with children. How do we acquire knowledge? How can we be relatively certain that what we believe is actually true? So for matters of fact, then we can still discuss what the political implications are, and we can still disagree about them by a very large degree. But what happens now is that people don't even believe in the facts if they think they have implications that they don't like.
Yeah, I wonder then, in this whole area of decision making as a science, like, do you think the goal of changing other people's mind is ever attainable?
Yes. I mean, it's not that we don't have any impact, right? I mean, social contagion is as you said, is extremely strong. And I think like the prime example that is still around for me, and it's still surprising, is religion, actually. Most people tend to have the religion of their parents. And it's completely obvious that had they lived at other times or in other places, they would, with the same certainty, believe in completely different gods, which for me is like a very strong argument why I wouldn't believe in any of this. And I find it so surprising how strongly convinced people are that this is the truth. So there is the strong element of social contagion, of who is around you, and who has had an imprint on you and how you believe. But I still think that this is can be subject to change if we teach people also that science is not so much about the answers. It's a method of acquiring knowledge, and it's never perfect, and it's uncertain and everything, but it's still the best we can do in a way. And I think this is something that we can teach to people, and we can show them that it actually matters to them. Yeah, that they can make better decisions, for instance, about their health. If they know and understand the stuff, they can reject treatments that are very costly but have very little benefit, that are actually also around, and they can focus on things that are really beneficial and not so costly. So I think people can learn to live with that and to think like that. And I think we need a science education in that direction. I mean, we have so many great examples in history how humanity got moving forward by scientific discoveries, right? I mean, we had clean water, we had antibiotics, we have vaccination. I mean, these are probably the biggest breakthroughs in medicine, and we've benefited from them so strongly. So I have not given up hope that we can enlighten people and actually change people's mind.
How do you think, or how do you even start to measure the perception of risk in everyday life?
Well, we have very different methods of studying the perception of risk. I mean, the good thing with studying humans rather than non-human animals is that you can simply ask them.
Yes.
You can simply ask them, how risky do you think this is? How worried are you about X? What do you think the probability of something bad happening would be? And so there's many ways to ask people and to get at people's estimate. You can also have incentivized methods by paying them for accuracy, or having like a willingness to pay to reduce the risk, or something like that. So you can get at least like at an ordinal scale of how risky they perceive different things. Then we have more indirect measures of risk perception that don't assess risk perception directly, but that actually study behavior under risk. So risky choice or probability learning in these experiments where people have to make choices. And in the course of making choices, they will learn or experience probabilistic information, or they will be told this probabilistic information, and you can see what kind of choices they make, and you can assess whether they are risk averse or risk seeking or whatnot. So you have behavioral methods, and then you can model the underlying risk perception in some way, and also in many, for instance, reinforcement learning models that are also popular in biology. You have risk perception or probability perception somehow in as a function of expectations that people can learn, and then rewards or harm that they could take could be the outcome side. Yeah, so there's these methods, and so that we can do in the laboratory, and then of course you can go out in the wild and look at observational data in the wild, and you can also try to induce something about risk perception. So one thing that Gerd Gigerenzer and later on also myself studied was how people after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the elderly among us remember probably, how people started to avoid taking airplanes and started getting into the car more and more. And we also saw in the data that they did this particularly in proximity to the terror sites. So in proximity to New York City, for instance, this kind of replacement behavior was much more pronounced than in other parts of the US, right? And what it did was that there were many more driving fatalities in the aftermath of 9/11. So
I can imagine,
it's estimated that 1,600 people died in their cars, more than you'd expect from the data from the previous years. Yeah, so of course this is just an estimate; it's observational data, but it's actually quite a number of additional fatalities, and from that we can not really strongly deduce, but somehow infer that something with people's risk perception must have changed, and that the risk perception could be one factor that actually then fuels the driving behavior or the avoidance of flying. So then we didn't ask any individual about the risk perception, but by the collective pattern of behavior, we can also infer something about collective risk perception. So these would be like very different methods that we can use, and all of them, I think, tell us something about how people perceive risk.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because when you think of risk, it's often like a negative connotation, right? Like almost I have in my mind, like people perceive risk a little bit like stress, that too much is not good, too little, then you're not very productive. But I think for most people, it's just very difficult to realize that I'm risk averse or risk prone, and then adjusting accordingly. Do you ever look at that, for example?
Yes, we look at that often, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And typically the message is that people are too risk averse for their own good, because risk is obviously correlated with reward. So the higher the risk, the higher the potential reward also will be. So it is typically the risk takers who are on the upper end of distributions, and who we see as successful role models. They have probably taken a lot of risks, but they're also at the lower end of the distribution, those who actually then had bad luck and it didn't work out. So you see them at the extremes, and by avoiding risk, you kind of tend to stay in the middle, will not be very successful, and I mean in any domain. Yeah, so so this is something I find interesting, and also what you can observe is that it's not domain general. It's actually domain specific. So there may be people who are willing to take financial risks or social risks or health risks, but these may be very different people. So it's not. I mean, you may have people who are generally more risk prone or risk averse, but it may also be domain specific. So, and you cannot always infer from one domain to the other. And I think this is also something that people need to learn in some way, that you need to take some risks to, for instance, be successful, and be it on the job market, be it on the mating market, be it anywhere, actually. I think without risk, there will rarely be any interesting reward also. Yeah? So, and what you say about the negative connotation is also interesting. So Ralf Hertwig and his colleagues, also at the Berlin Max Planck Institute, director, he has studied how, with sentiment analysis, with historical text data, how the sentiments around risk have actually changed over the past decades. And it didn't used to be so negative, actually. So it has actually turned to be a more negative connotation nowadays than it has been many decades ago, which is also something that I find interesting, because for me, risk is also it has many positive associations.
So Wolfgang just mentioned there's a change in the concept of risk over time. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yes, so he's referring to a study that has been carried out on 3 large corpus of English written text, but the results also hold in French, German, Italian, and Spanish. So basically, these researchers, by using natural language processing, which is a machine learning algorithm, they could show that the meaning of the word risk becomes more and more negative over time. And they compared this evolution with the evolution of other words such as hazard, danger, or death. And basically, only for the word risk, the evolution became more and more negative over time.
So what are the variables that are driving these change to become more negative?
So risk perception also changes over the lifespan of individuals and also around the world. So in a study with 77 countries, they could show that risk taking is decreasing with age. It's also lower in women, and risk taking is actually higher in countries with bad socioeconomic conditions.
So what you're saying is in good socioeconomic countries, basically young male takes the most risks, while in bad socioeconomical countries, everyone takes risks.
Yes, that's exactly that.
Let's get back to Wolfgang.
Maybe it could also be because we feel like we have more data, we have more information. And then there's nothing out there for us to go out and risk and find out. And maybe just like a thought that popped up in my brain, actually, that people perhaps go out and risk more because sometimes they don't have a choice. Sometimes you need to get on a boat and go somewhere.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if the situation forces you to take risk, then and this is also true in non-human animals, then of course you take a high risk. But I think actually people may be more risk averse in many areas than they used to be. I mean, I see, for instance, that the space, the free space that children get is much more limited than it used to be. So the space that my kids are getting is probably more limited than the space I had, and my space was already more limited than the space my parents had. Like space for free exploration, parent-free time, and also the ability to make mistakes on your own.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, in the US, there has been the debate on playgrounds. Whether on these climbing tools, I don't know the right terms for them, there should be mattresses underneath.
No, the monkey bars. It has to be.
Yeah, and I mean, what do you teach kids with that? Falling doesn't hurt, right? But falling does hurt, and I think it's important that you learn in a slow and kind of controlled fashion to deal with risk, to experience risk, and also to experience, like, preferably a non-fatal side of risk, that something bad can also happen. And I think you need to experience that to some degree to become a risk-savvy person in the end. Yeah? And now we try to avoid too much of that, I guess, as a society.
It's even a wonder that parents let the children try to learn biking, because you will fall, it will hurt, and still. Yeah. No, that's really, really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about being a researcher right now? What keeps you going?
What keeps me going? I mean, there's a lot of things I love about being a researcher, and probably first and foremost is the freedom that comes with it. I mean, it's also a responsibility to organize your day on your own. Nobody is telling you what to do and when to do it exactly. So I can select people I'd like to work with, and they select me or don't. I mean, and it can be so motivating. So this is also what motivates me to work in the cluster collective behavior. There's so many brilliant people there. I think this is really the most brilliant, most inspiring, and most fun community also at the university here. And I think all of these parts are important. Another part that's fun about, especially being a decision scientist, make advertisement for the decision sciences here, is that it spans from the completely abstract problem-solving part. So if you like complex puzzles and things like that, and things that the world wouldn't care about at all, some weird problem that you can study and that's fun intellectually, you can do it in the decision sciences, and that's fun, and my group loves that. So thinking about some statistic and why it's difficult to understand that nobody maybe ever cares about, but we find it's cool and funny. But all the way up to totally applied. So I'm heavily involved also in the further education of physicians, for instance, teaching people about dealing with statistics, about how to convince people of vaccination, for instance, how to talk to people about these issues, how to make better health decisions, and stuff like that. And this is also extremely rewarding to have real physicians who get their hands dirty, which I don't. I'm in the ivory tower. I don't get my hands dirty. But to have them as discussion partners and a sanity check, whether anything that we study is actually relevant to them or not, or which parts are relevant and which ones are not. This is extremely rewarding. We have this large project with the WHO and Meta at the moment, where we also work on designing health, or I'm actually a consultant, a consulting role here, on designing health messages that have an impact on social media, competing with everything else that's out there, right? Which I also find fascinating. Go out in the wild with our research and see what impact we can have there. I mean, if we study people in the lab, we can force them to read through our materials, and there's nothing they can do. They are paid for doing that. But of course, it's more interesting to study this in the real world. And then maybe we can have a very small impact on making this world a better place, on making it a more enlightened place.
Having this hunger for knowledge and having this passion for specific fields will help you a long way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I had such a lovely time talking to you today.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and see you next time.